April 18, 1942. The Japanese Empire was at the height of its power, undefeated, unstoppable, and unchallenged on its home soil. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the jungles of Malaya, Imperial Japan had crushed everything in its path. The rising sun flew over half the Pacific, but on this cold, gray morning, something impossible was happening in the skies above Tokyo. American bombers, lumbering twin-engine planes that were never supposed to fly this far, were emerging from the clouds, heading straight for the Japanese capital. For the first time in history, Japanese civilians heard the scream of enemy aircraft over their homeland. For the first time, the unshakable confidence of the empire began to crack. And what came next would send shockwaves across the world. A daring mission so reckless, so audacious, that even its commander doubted anyone would return alive. This was the Doolittle Raid. To understand why the Doolittle Raid mattered so much, why it stunned Japan and electrified America, we have to go back to the dark winter of 1942. Just 4 months earlier, the United States had been humiliated at Pearl Harbor. More than 2,400 Americans killed, the Pacific Fleet crippled, and the nation thrust into war overnight. The Japanese military, confident and ruthless, expanded rapidly across Asia and the Pacific. Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, and Singapore all had fallen in rapid succession. The Japanese advance seemed unstoppable, and morale in America was at rock bottom. President Franklin D. Roosevelt needed something, anything, to show that the U.S. was still in the fight. He told his advisors, "We need to hit Japan as soon as possible. We need to show them it can be done." But there was a problem, a massive one. Japan was too far away. The U.S. didn't have bases close enough for traditional bombers to reach the Japanese mainland and return safely. At that point, the only American-controlled territory in the Pacific, Midway, Wake, and Hawaii, were thousands of miles away from Tokyo. The Army Air Forces said it couldn't be done. The Navy said it was suicide. And yet, one man believed otherwise. His name was Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle. Doolittle wasn't your typical officer. He was a scientist, an engineer, a test pilot, and a daredevil. He'd set speed records, performed stunts that other pilots called insane, and even earned a doctorate from MIT in aeronautical engineering. When the order came from President Roosevelt to strike Japan, Doolittle saw an opportunity to make the impossible possible. Doolittle's idea was as bold as it was desperate. Launch Army B-25 Mitchell bombers, medium-range land-based aircraft, from the deck of an aircraft carrier. It had never been done before. No one had even considered it. The B-25s were far larger than any naval plane. They needed over 1,200 feet of runway to take off. A carrier deck gave them less than 500. And once launched, they couldn't come back. This would be a one-way mission. The plan: sail the aircraft carrier USS Hornet as close to Japan as possible, about 450 miles off the coast, then launch the bombers, hit targets in Tokyo and other cities, and continue west toward China, where friendly forces might help the crews escape. Every man who volunteered knew the odds. Doolittle didn't sugarcoat it. "We'll hit Japan, but we may not make it back." 80 men stepped forward, 80 volunteers who were willing to fly into the unknown. They trained in secret at Eglin Field, Florida, learning how to take off heavy bombers from short runways, simulating carrier decks using painted lines on the tarmac. They stripped down their planes, removing guns and gear to save weight, adding extra fuel tanks, and practicing low-level flying to evade radar. Every pilot knew that once they launched, there was no going back. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Japanese Empire was growing increasingly arrogant. Tokyo's newspapers proclaimed that Japan was invincible. Civilians were told that their home islands were too far away to ever be attacked. American morale, the papers mocked, was broken beyond repair. But in Washington, D.C., President Roosevelt smiled faintly when reporters asked when America would strike back. He simply said, "Soon, there will be a reply." By early April 1942, the plan was ready. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers were hoisted onto the deck of the USS Hornet, tied down and shrouded in secrecy. The sailors aboard had no idea what was happening until the ship's loudspeakers announced, "This force is bound for Tokyo." For the first time, the crew erupted in cheers.
Finally, America was taking the fight to the enemy's doorstep. The task force, codenamed Task Force 16, was commanded by Admiral William F. Halsey, a fierce, aggressive naval officer known for his no-nonsense attitude. He led both the Hornet and the USS Enterprise, which provided fighter cover.
Their route would take them dangerously close to Japan, through waters patrolled by enemy ships, submarines, and aircraft. If discovered, the mission could end in disaster. On the morning of April 18th, the fleet was still 650 miles from Japan, farther than planned, when lookouts spotted a Japanese patrol vessel. The Americans opened fire, sinking the ship, but not before it sent a warning message to Tokyo. Doolittle faced a decision: launch now, far earlier than planned, or turn back. If they waited, Japan would be ready. If they launched now, they might not have enough fuel to reach China. Doolittle didn't hesitate. He turned to his men and said simply, "Let's go." One by one, the bombers thundered down the Hornet's deck, engines screaming, barely lifting off before the edge of the ship vanished beneath them. Sailors watched in awe as those massive aircraft clawed into the gray sky, their bellies heavy with bombs, their fate uncertain. Jimmy Doolittle ES plane was the first to take off, a symbol of courage at the front of a mission no one thought possible. As the last bomber disappeared into the horizon, every man aboard the carrier knew America's counterpunch had begun. 16 planes, 80 men. Thousands of miles from home, heading straight for the heart of Imperial Japan. This was no longer about revenge, it was about awakening a nation. As the bombers left the USS Hornet behind them, the Pacific stretched out like an endless gray desert. 16 B-25s, each weighed down with fuel and explosives, skimmed low over the waves. There were no fighter escorts, no second chances, just the cold sea below and the distant, invisible target ahead. Japan. At the controls of the lead plane, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle glanced at his instruments. He knew the risk they were taking. The early launch meant they'd have to fly over 800 miles to reach their targets, and another 1,200 to try and make China. That was beyond the B-25's range. Still, there was no turning back. The men were calm, focused, and driven by something deeper than orders: vengeance, pride, and the desire to prove that America could strike back. Inside each bomber, the crews sat in tight, unheated compartments. The roar of the engines was deafening. The men were bundled in leather jackets, gloves, and goggles, but the cold seeped in as they climbed higher. Each plane had its target: Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka. Their goal wasn't massive destruction, it was psychological. They were to bomb military facilities, factories, and oil tanks, but most importantly, to show Japan that the war wasn't untouchable. For the Japanese people, who had been told their homeland was invulnerable, it would be a devastating revelation. The flight took long, silent hours. Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter, aboard plane number 10, later recalled, "There was nothing to see but water and cloud. It felt like flying toward the edge of the earth." The crews ate small rations, monitored fuel, and occasionally checked maps taped to their knees. They flew at barely 200 feet above the sea to avoid detection, dipping so low that waves splashed their bombers' bellies. And then, after 6 hours of flight, land appeared. Japan. At 12:15 p.m., Doolittle's bomber approached Tokyo. The weather was cloudy, with breaks of sunlight that glimmered on the rooftops below. Smoke rose from factories, trains moved along the rails, and civilians walked the streets, oblivious to the danger above. Doolittle took a deep breath and gave the command: bombs away. The first bombs of the war to fall on Japan tumbled from his aircraft, crashing into military warehouses and industrial plants near Tokyo Bay. Moments later, explosions rippled across the capital. Fires erupted, air raid sirens wailed. For the first time, the people of Tokyo were witnessing what Americans had endured at Pearl Harbor. All across Japan, the impossible was happening. Other B-25s swept in, dropping bombs on Yokohama's dockyards, Kobe's shipbuilding plants, and Nagoya's aircraft factories. The Japanese military was caught completely off guard. Radar operators scrambled. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. But by then, the bombers were gone. Moving fast and low, they vanished back into the clouds before most defenses could react. Civilian witnesses later described it as surreal. "We thought the planes must be ours. No one believed Americans could reach Tokyo, but they were wrong." The damage itself was minor, but the psychological impact was massive. For the first time in the war, the Japanese government faced panic on its own soil. Tokyo's radio stations abruptly cut off their music programs and went silent. Fire crews rushed through the city. The imperial palace went into lockdown. When Emperor Hirohito was informed that enemy bombers had struck the capital, he reportedly stood in stunned silence. The illusion of Japanese invulnerability, carefully built through propaganda, shattered in an instant. Meanwhile, for the American pilots, there was no time to celebrate. Their fuel was running dangerously low. They had to climb back over the Sea of Japan and head for the coast of China, praying they'd make it before nightfall. The weather turned worse, heavy clouds, rain, and gusting winds. Navigation became almost impossible. One by one, the planes began running out of fuel. Some crews bailed out in darkness. Others crash-landed in rice fields or mountains. A few were captured. Others disappeared entirely, never to be seen again. Doolittle's own plane ran out of fuel near the Chinese coast. He and his crew bailed out at night, tumbling into darkness. Doolittle landed in a field, rolled to his feet, and looked around. He was alive. His men were scattered, but all survived. When they regrouped days later, Doolittle confessed to his crew that he expected to be court-martialed. He believed the mission had failed, that the loss of all 16 planes outweighed whatever small damage they had caused. But he was wrong. Word of the raid reached Washington days later. At first, no one believed it. Then, President Roosevelt went on radio and announced it proudly to the nation. The American people erupted in joy. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, there was hope, real, tangible hope, that Japan could be hit back. Roosevelt, ever clever, told reporters the bombers had launched from a secret base in Shangri-La, referencing a mythical land from a popular novel. In truth, he was covering for the Chinese allies who had helped rescue the crews, and who would soon pay dearly for it. Because while the Doolittle Raiders were celebrated in America, Japan was preparing to unleash a brutal response in Asia. While America celebrated its first daring blow against Japan, the mood in Tokyo was very different. What the Americans saw as a symbol of hope, Japan saw as humiliation, an insult that cut deep into the pride of an empire that believed itself untouchable. On April 19, 1942, the day after the Doolittle Raid, the Imperial General Headquarters was thrown into chaos. Top military leaders, including Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, gathered in emergency meetings to answer a single question. How could this happen? The Japanese people had been told the homeland was safe, that no enemy could ever cross the vast Pacific. Yet here were American bombers dropping bombs over Tokyo, Yokohama, and Nagoya. Even though the damage was limited, the blow to morale was devastating. For the Japanese leadership, this wasn't just a surprise attack, it was a direct challenge to their authority. They needed someone to blame, and they needed to restore the illusion of control. Their fury, however, wasn't directed at America. It fell instead on those caught in between, the Chinese civilians and soldiers who had helped the downed American crews escape. When Japanese intelligence learned that several American airmen had been rescued by the Chinese, they launched one of the most brutal retaliations of the entire war. It would become known as the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. Beginning in May 1942, Japanese forces invaded eastern China with more than 100,000 troops, sweeping across the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi in search of the Americans and anyone who had aided them. The campaign quickly descended into horror. Japanese troops burned entire villages to the ground, slaughtered civilians, and executed anyone suspected of helping the Doolittle flyers. Hospitals were destroyed, schools wiped out, and wells poisoned. Historians estimate that between 250,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians were killed during the retaliation. The Japanese called it cleansing the region. To the rest of the world, it was another atrocity, one born of vengeance and humiliation. Back in the United States, the American public had no idea of the scale of Japan's reprisal. All they knew was that their airmen were heroes. In reality, only one of the 16 Doolittle bombers managed to land safely, and that was in Soviet territory, where the crew was detained and later smuggled out. The rest either crash-landed or were forced to bail out over China. Out of the 80 men who launched from the Hornet, 3 were killed during the mission. 8 were captured by the Japanese. Of those 8, 3 were executed, and 1 died of starvation in captivity. Their sacrifice, however, became part of something much larger, because the Doolittle Raid, small as it was, shook the Japanese high command to its core. In the weeks following the raid, Japanese intelligence scrambled to determine how American bombers had reached Japan. Their conclusion, though incorrect, was chillingly decisive. They believed the bombers had launched from bases in Midway or Hawaii, or even from secret airfields in China. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, realized that if the Americans were able to strike Japan once, they could do it again, and next time, the damage might be far worse. He concluded that Japan's outer defensive ring had to be expanded and reinforced. To eliminate the American threat, Japan needed to destroy what remained of the U.S. Navy, permanently, and that decision would lead directly to the Battle of Midway. The Doolittle Raid, in a way, forced Japan's hand. Before April 1942, Yamamoto had been cautious, preferring to consolidate Japan's recent conquests. After the raid, he became obsessed with drawing the U.S. Navy into a trap, one decisive battle that would crush American morale forever. Japan's plan was bold: lure the remaining American carriers into the open near Midway Atoll, ambush them, and wipe them from the sea. The Japanese believed their carriers were superior, their pilots unmatched, and their navy invincible. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that American codebreakers had already cracked key portions of Japan's naval communication system. They knew when and where the attack would come. The shockwaves of the Doolittle Raid were already echoing across the Pacific, setting the stage for one of the most decisive naval battles in history. For Jimmy Doolittle and his men, though, the war was far from over. After being rescued by Chinese villagers, Doolittle was smuggled out to safety. When he finally returned to America, he expected to face disgrace. He told his superiors, "I thought the mission was a failure. We lost every plane we had." But instead of punishment, Doolittle was promoted. 2 ranks, straight to Brigadier General. He received the Medal of Honor personally from President Roosevelt. When reporters asked if the mission had been worth it, Doolittle said humbly, "We showed the Japanese that they were not invincible, that we could and would come for them." The Doolittle Raiders had done more than bomb Tokyo. They had changed the course of the war, not through destruction, but through belief. They gave the United States something it desperately needed: confidence, and they gave Japan something it had never known before: fear. That fear would drive Japan to make one of the greatest strategic mistakes of the entire Pacific War, a mistake that would cost them dearly in the months to come. The Doolittle Raid was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of Japan's unraveling, a chain reaction that would explode at Midway. In the aftermath of the Doolittle Raid, Japan's confidence was shaken, but not shattered. The empire of the rising sun still ruled vast swaths of the Pacific. Its armies stood unchallenged in Southeast Asia, and its navy remained the most powerful on Earth. But beneath that surface of dominance, something had changed. The Doolittle Raid had planted a seed: fear. For the first time, Japan realized that its home islands were vulnerable. The humiliation of seeing Tokyo bombed forced Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant but cautious architect of Pearl Harbor, into a dangerous position. He had to act, and act fast. He knew that unless he struck another decisive blow, America's industrial power and newfound morale could turn the tide of the war. So, in May 1942, Yamamoto conceived an audacious plan, one meant to end the U.S. Navy once and for all. His target, a small speck in the Pacific called Midway Atoll, barely 2 miles long but strategically priceless. Midway sat almost exactly halfway between Asia and North America. Whoever controlled it controlled the Central Pacific. Yamamoto's idea was to draw the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers into a trap. He would attack Midway, forcing the Americans to defend it. Then, as the U.S. fleet rushed in, Japan's carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would ambush and annihilate them. It would be Pearl Harbor in reverse. A total victory that would cripple America's ability to fight for years. To make sure nothing went wrong, Yamamoto committed almost his entire fleet, more than 160 ships, 8 aircraft carriers, and thousands of men. But there was one problem, a fatal one. The Americans already knew. Thanks to brilliant U.S. Navy codebreakers in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, the U.S. had cracked a key portion of Japan's naval code, known as JN-25. By mid-May, they intercepted Japanese messages referencing an upcoming operation targeting a location referred to as AF. But what was AF? To confirm their suspicion, American intelligence at Midway sent a fake radio message claiming their water purification system had broken down. Soon after, Japanese code traffic reported that AF is short on water. It was all the proof Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, needed. The Japanese were coming for Midway, and now he could prepare the trap for them. Nimitz immediately assembled what little he had. The carriers USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown were the only ones left to defend the Pacific. Yorktown had been heavily damaged just weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea, yet shipyard workers in Pearl Harbor repaired her in just 72 hours. The Americans set sail, heading for Midway. Unknown to Yamamoto, Nimitz had placed his carriers north of the atoll, waiting in ambush, hidden by the vast Pacific and armed with the priceless weapon of surprise. By June 3, 1942, both fleets were in position. The most decisive naval battle of the Second World War was about to begin. At dawn on June 4th, Japanese bombers launched from their carriers and struck Midway. The attack was devastating. Fuel tanks exploded, runways burned, but the island's defenses held. As the Japanese bombers returned to refuel and rearm, their flight decks became cluttered with fuel lines, bombs, and torpedoes, a deadly mix, just waiting for a spark. Meanwhile, American scout planes had spotted the Japanese fleet. The signal went out. Enemy carriers sighted. The trap was about to spring. From the decks of the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, waves of American dive bombers and torpedo planes roared into the sky. Many of the torpedo squadrons were wiped out before reaching their targets, slaughtered by Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Entire crews vanished into the sea. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. As the Japanese fighters were drawn down low to fend off the torpedo planes, a new wave of American dive bombers appeared overhead, unnoticed, unopposed, and perfectly positioned. At 10:22 a.m., from 20,000 feet above, they dove. The sky filled with screaming engines and thunder. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. Explosions tore through their decks as bombs ignited the fuel lines and ordnance below. The once invincible Japanese carrier force was being destroyed in front of its own eyes. Yamamoto's fleet was in shock. Decades of naval tradition, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was collapsing in a single morning. Still, one carrier, the Hiryu, remained. Its pilots launched 2 desperate counterattacks that struck and crippled the Yorktown. But the Americans responded with another furious strike. By sunset, Hiryu too was burning, her crew abandoning ship as the sun dipped below the Pacific horizon. 4 Japanese carriers, 4 of the 6 that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were gone. Thousands of Japan's best pilots and crew perished. The might of the Imperial Navy had been shattered. When Admiral Yamamoto received the news aboard his flagship, he was silent for a long time. Then quietly, He ordered the retreat. He knew what this meant. Japan's dream of dominating the Pacific had ended that day. The Doolittle Raid, that small, daring strike months earlier, had triggered a chain of events that led directly to Midway. From humiliation came overconfidence. From overconfidence came disaster. Japan would never again regain the initiative. For the men who fought there, on both sides, Midway became a symbol. For Japan, it marked the beginning of the end. For the United States, it marked rebirth, proof that courage and intelligence could overcome even the most powerful enemy. And for Jimmy Doolittle, watching from afar, it was vindication. His raid had seemed like a small flicker of defiance, but that flicker had grown into a flame that now turned the tide of the entire Pacific War. The Pacific was still vast, and the war far from over. But for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States was no longer on the defensive. Japan had awakened the giant, and now it would feel his wrath. As the smoke cleared over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the scene was apocalyptic. The mighty Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were gone. Their burning wrecks drifted silently, black columns of smoke rising like funeral pyres over the vast ocean. It was the first time in modern history that Japan had suffered such a staggering defeat at sea. Out of 248 carrier planes that had launched that morning, barely a handful made it back. And more devastating still, Japan had lost hundreds of its best pilots, men who had trained for years in the art of carrier warfare. Those men could not be replaced. On the American side, the cost had been high too. The carrier USS Yorktown, a ship already battered from the Coral Sea, took torpedo hits and eventually sank beneath the waves. 141 sailors went down with her. But despite the loss, the victory was total. Admiral Chester Nimitz's gamble had paid off. Against overwhelming odds, the United States had destroyed the core of Japan's striking power in a single day. The balance of the Pacific had shifted forever. When word of the victory reached Washington, D.C., President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew immediately what it meant. The United States was no longer fighting for survival. It was now fighting for dominance. Factories across the nation roared to life. New carriers, planes, and submarines rolled out faster than Japan could even replace its losses. For every ship Japan built, America built 10. The tide of war had turned. In Tokyo, the mood was grim. Admiral Yamamoto, who had once warned Japan's leaders that they were awakening a sleeping giant, now saw his prophecy fulfilled. Midway had exposed the fatal flaw in Japan's war strategy, their overconfidence. The empire that had expanded so swiftly across the Pacific now began to shrink. Island by island, battle by battle, the U.S. would push westward. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, all the way to Japan's doorstep. For the men who fought at Midway, it wasn't just a victory, it was survival. Pilots like Lieutenant Dick Best, who delivered the fatal blow to Akagi and Hiryu, returned as heroes. Many never came home. But their courage ensured that the United States could stand again after Pearl Harbor's devastation. Midway was the proof that America's spirit could not be broken. In the years that followed, historians would call it the most stunning and decisive naval victory in history. But to the men who lived it, it was something simpler. A moment when hope returned to a dark world. The Pacific would never be the same. And from that day on, the rising sun began to set. The Battle of Midway was more than a fight for an island. It was the moment the war began to turn, and the world began to change. When the news of the Midway disaster reached Tokyo, it hit Japan like an earthquake. The once invincible Imperial Navy, the same force that had terrorized the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, was now crippled. 4 of its 6 frontline carriers, the pride of Japan's fleet, were gone. The government tried to hide the truth. Newspapers printed vague stories of minor losses, but whispers spread quickly through the ranks of the Japanese military. The sense of invincibility was shattered. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, The man who had masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor sat in silence as the casualty lists grew. He knew what it meant. He had warned Japan's leaders before the war. I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success. Midway happened exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. His prophecy had come true. For the United States, Midway was more than a victory. It was redemption. Pearl Harbor had left the nation wounded, humiliated, and desperate. But Midway restored its faith. It proved that America could strike back, could fight toe-to-toe with Japan's best, and win. The Doolittle Raid, months earlier, had been the spark, a daring but symbolic attack that showed Japan it wasn't untouchable. But Midway was the hammer blow, the moment Japan truly felt that America's fight had only just begun. What many don't realize, however, is just how fragile that victory was. Luck, yes, luck, played a huge part in Midway's outcome. U.S. intelligence had broken parts of the Japanese naval code. They guessed AF was Midway and set a clever trap, but it could have gone either way. At one point during the battle, all 3 U.S. carriers had their decks filled with fueled planes, bombs being loaded, engines warming up, just as the Japanese had been earlier. Had Japan's search planes spotted them a few minutes sooner, history itself might have changed. Yet fate and courage were on America's side. The Japanese never recovered. From Midway onward, their empire began to crumble. The U.S. Navy, growing stronger every month, pushed westward with relentless force. In 1943, American forces began their island-hopping campaign. By 1944, Japan was fighting a defensive war, and by 1945, the empire that had once dreamed of conquering the Pacific was reduced to ashes. But everything, every step, every victory, traced back to that single, decisive clash at Midway. Years later, survivors from both sides reflected on what the battle truly meant. American pilot Ensign George Gay, the only survivor from his entire torpedo squadron, said, "I saw the Japanese carriers burning. I knew we had done it. I knew we'd stopped them." And from Japan, one officer admitted with sadness, "After Midway, we knew the war could not be won, but no one dared to say it aloud." The Doolittle Raid and the Battle of Midway became forever linked, the spark and the storm. Together they marked the turning of a tide that would eventually sweep across the Pacific and bring the war to an end. Today, the men who flew those missions are remembered not just as warriors, but as symbols of resilience. They fought when hope was gone. They stood up when the world was falling apart. And they showed that courage, even in the face of impossible odds, can change history. If this story moved you, if you believe that history, as greatest moments, deserve to be remembered, then make sure to subscribe and join us on this journey through the forgotten battles, the untold heroes, and the turning points that shaped our world. Because the past still has lessons to teach, and stories like this remind us why they must never be forgotten. This was the story of the Doolittle Raid, and the moment Japan realized that America's fight had only just begun.